Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Barsanti, and I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for a joint program between the Library Company and Christ Church. This is a panel about, we're going to have a presentation from the former director of the Library Company, John Van Horne, who's going to be talking about the Reverend Thomas Bray and his associates. Been very much looking forward to this talk. I know this was a talk that we had originally thought was going to be in person, and then we thought it was going to be hybrid. And then as we got closer to the event, it seemed prudent to just have the whole event online. So I thank you for putting up with all of the changes there. And I'm glad that we have a lot of people who've found their way here online. Thank you for attending. I'm going to hand over the camera now to Barbara Hogue, who will introduce John Van Horne for you. But Barbara is here from Christ Church. Well, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone to our continued 325th anniversary series of virtual events. And we're so pleased to partner with the Library Company to present this talk this evening. And I'm delighted to welcome John Van Horne, who will talk about the Reverend Thomas Bray and his associates. John Van Horne graduated from Princeton University and received his PhD in history from the University of Virginia. In 1985, he became the director of the Library Company of Philadelphia. For 29 years, Dr. Van Horne guided the fortunes of this independent research library with extensive collections of rare books documenting all aspects of American history through the end of the 19th century. He retired from the Library Company in 2014 and is now the Director Emeritus. He was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2015, and we are so pleased to have him here tonight. Welcome, John Van Horne.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start by thanking Barbara Hogue and Carol Smith for inviting me to give this talk as part of Christ Church's 325th anniversary celebrations. Congratulations. And to the Library Company for so readily agreeing to co-host it. This is really a two-part story about libraries and Black education, and the parts are connected by one man, their relationship to Thomas Bray. The first story is about one of the earliest libraries ever established in America, certainly the first one in Philadelphia, at Christ Church in about 1700. And the second story is about one of the earliest efforts to educate some of Philadelphia's Black children, both enslaved and free, at schools affiliated with Christ Church from 1758 through the mid-1840s, a span of almost 90 years. The first story is based largely on the work of my predecessor at the Library Company, Edwin Wolf II, who wrote about the Christ Church books right after they came to the Library Company to be in our custody in 1966. He wrote about it pretty extensively in our annual report for that year, and also in this essay he wrote for the catalog of the University Hospital Antiques Show in 1987. 1967. And the second story is based primarily on work I did about 40 years ago as my doctoral dissertation about the associates of Dr. Bray and their work in America. But I ended, as you can see from the title, I ended my story about the time of the Revolution when the associates ceased all their activities in the colonies. And so for this talk, I had to delve back into the archives and do some more research to flesh out the story of the years in the post-revolution till its conclusion in the 1840s. So first, a brief biography of Thomas Bray. He was one of the leading figures in the history of the Church of England, but he never rose to a very high position. He was never a bishop, for instance, but he was nonetheless hugely influential. He was educated at Oxford University, BA and DD. And in 1696, he published what he called his catechetical lectures, which were then, as you see later, republished. And this brought him to the attention of Henry Compton, the Bishop of London. And at that time, it was the bishops of London who had really the jurisdiction over the Anglican Church in the American colonies. So Bray's involvement came about at that point when Compton appointed him his commissary or deputy in Maryland. And Bray immediately began thinking about the church's need for qualified clergy in the colonies and about the clergy's needs for books, which to improve themselves and their congregations. He was only present in the American colonies very briefly in Maryland from 1699 to 1700, but by then the focus of his life had clearly been established. He was a prolific and persuasive advocate for his ideas, which he expressed in a torrent of publications in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The most important is probably the Biblioteca Paropialis, which you see on the left, which was his scheme for organizing books into libraries that could serve primarily the clergy. And he had a scheme of working his way up from small parish libraries to larger, what he called deanery libraries, to major libraries that would have been, one for each province. And that was similar to the one that he provided to Philadelphia. And then he wrote these other works as well, essays about promoting useful knowledge in His Majesty's dominions, both at home and abroad, proposals for the encouragement of religion and learning in the Florin plantations, a memorial about the present state of religion in North America, and finally his work on the Layman's Library. And this was a book about a scheme for providing books for the use of the laity as well as the clergy. And you see there, he wanted to have them be able to be lent out and called in, except for a few to be given outright, according to the discretion of the minister thereof. So this was really the beginning of the concept of the public library in America. Bray was very good at identifying needs to be filled, and he set about single-mindedly to create organizations to meet them. And we'll meet these organizations in a minute. But I'm reminded here of Franklin, who also had the same knack for identifying needs, recruiting associates, and creating institutions to meet those needs, whether it was a library or a learned society or a fire company or an insurance company or a town watch. I think the two men had a lot in common. And Bray's vision was to create organizations to spread and strengthen the Anglican Church throughout the British Empire. He first sought to do this by getting support from Parliament, but that was not forthcoming. So then, like Franklin, he sought to create voluntary associations to accomplish his goals. And out of his hopes and plans and persistence grew the three organizations that we'll be concerned about today. The first was the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, 1698. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the SPG, 1701. And finally, the Associates of the late Dr. Bray, 1730. And that's really the second part of our story. The SPCK was committed to promoting learning and religion in the plantations abroad. And they did this by publishing and distributing Christian literature, establishing libraries, and by encouraging Christian education at all levels. And they're still active today, and they are the third largest publishing house in the UK after the university presses of Oxford and Cambridge. The SPG's main purpose was sending missionaries all over the world. And they were very active in the American colonies, including Pennsylvania. And they're still active today under the same initials of the USPG, but it's now the United Society Partners in the Gospel. And then the third organization is the Bray Associates, which we'll get to shortly. Now to the Christ Church Library. In the SPG archives is this manuscript volume in fairly rough shape called Biblioteca Provincialis Americanae, which was a register of books sent to these 6 colonies to establish these provincial libraries. And you see that Pennsylvania is one of them, noted there with the red hand. The center page is the first page of the register of books that came to Pennsylvania or to Philadelphia. And you see the first one is, of course, a Hebrew Bible. And then on the third page is a list of a supplement of books that were sent in 1701 to augment that initial library. So with those 1701 editions, all told, the Bray gift was 291 volumes, of which 176 still survive on the shelves of the library company. They were really beautiful books. Most of them were leather bound and embossed and had a gold stamp on them, identifying them as Philadelphia Library property. And they all carried this book plate on the inside. Of those approximately 300 books, 2/3 were religious, and additional books were sent later, so that by 1730, there were around 500 volumes in the Christ Church Library. A couple of works came in those later shipments. These were published in 1702 and 1703, the Earl of Clarendon's History of the Rebellion and Thomas Bodley's Requilae Biblianae, which was his autobiography up to the year 1609, and the first draft of the statutes he drew up for what became the Bodleian Library at Oxford. As you might imagine, the choice of works was appropriately and overwhelmingly theological. There were Bibles, such as this Protestant version of the Latin Bible, London 1593, and the massive annotated Bible by Samuel Clarke, London 1690 on the right. There were also aids to biblical studies, such as Johannes Buxtorf's Hebrew Grammar on the left, Basel 1651, and a Chaldaic Lexicon, London 1646. I should say here that colonial clergy were generally well educated. Many of them had studied at Oxford and Cambridge, and they knew all of what are now called the dead languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But I really wonder how much use some of these would have had in the pretty rough Pennsylvania colony in the early days. Other works included Henri Estienne's Greek and Latin Concordance of the New Testament, Geneva 1594, and what was probably the most valuable book in the gift, 10 volumes folio bound in 5 of St. Augustine's works, Paris 1571. There were also commentaries on the Bible, many by Simon Patrick, the Bishop of Ely, who was one of Bray's coadjutors in the founding of both the SPCK and the SPG. And of course, there was controversial literature. The 17th century was known for its great antagonism between the established church and various other churches and dissenting sects. Bray was somewhat ecumenical in his choice of books. He actually included some Catholic missals and works by Quaker apologists, but mostly the works supported the Church of England. On the left, you see John Tillotson's classic work on the period against Catholicism. Tillotson, by the way, was favored by Franklin, who recommended him to the youth of Pennsylvania for his literary style. And on the right is Charles Leslie's bitterly anti-Quaker Snake in the Grass, or Satan Transformed into an Angel, with its wordy subtitle, denigrating Quakers and their pretended simplicity. There were works by the great scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam. On the left, his Praise of Folly, which was a satirical work attacking the superstitions of European society and the abuses of the Catholic Church. And on the right, his Enchiridion Militis Christiani, Cambridge 1685, which might translate as the Manual of the Christian Knight or the Handbook of the Christian Soldier, basically a guidebook on how to live a moral Christian life while avoiding formal rituals and observances. There were works of a more secular nature, such as Edwin Wingate's exact abridgment of all the statutes. This was actually the only single law book that was received. There were a number of medical texts sent. The list was 16 different books, but none of them survive. And it's thought that perhaps they were transferred in 1772 to Christ Church Hospital when it was founded by Dr. John Kearsley. And finally, there were some mathematics books. These were all typical 17th century basic textbooks, I guess you'd say. Wingate's Arithmetic on the left, William Laybourne's Cursus Mathematicus, or Course of Course of Mathematics on the right, London, 1690. William Oughtred's Clavis Mathematicae, or Key to Mathematics, Oxford, 1652. And of course, the obligatory Euclid's Geometry, London, 1659. There were later additions to the Christ Church Library. In the 1720s, Ludovic Sprogel gave a collection, 58 of which still survive. They included things like polyglot dictionaries, works on the canon law, German treatises, and church histories. So what became of the Christ Church Library? Well, over the years, it had been shelved in cupboards at the foot of the bell tower, in the basement of the rectory, and in the muniments room, which I'm not sure if that still exists or not, or maybe it's been turned into something else. Then in 1966, thanks to the good offices of Rector Ernest Harding and the rector's warden W. Beaumont Whitney II, the 176 remaining volumes from the initial Bray gift, plus many more volumes acquired in later years, moved to the custody of the library company, which had just opened its new building on Locust Street and had the space to accommodate the books, make protective boxes for them, do some conservation, catalog them, and make them available to readers in the library company's reading rooms. And so they have a happy life there today in the stacks of the library company. Now, to put this in context, one scholar has calculated that Bray, during his lifetime, and those acting in his name after his death, created 41 libraries in the American colonies, to which they shipped 22,000 books. So this was quite a significant undertaking. And before we leave the Christ Church Library, I have a little sidelight here. The library company also houses about 150 books and pamphlets from St. Peter's Church, which of course at one time was joined to Christ Church as the United Congregations. And among those books is a 1775 prayer book used by Bishop William White. And there are numerous manuscript additions and corrections throughout. And the most intriguing is this one, where he has struck out a lot of the prayers for King George and the royal family. And he's substituted new wording suitable to the American church. And so here within the red box, you can see he's replaced the original wording, which mentions thy servant George, and asks that it please God to endue the Congress of these United States and all others in authority, legislative, judicial, and executive, with grace, wisdom, and understanding, to execute justice and to maintain truth. So, now, the second intersection of Bray and Christ Church concerns Black education in Philadelphia. And this is where the third organization established by Bray after the SPCK and the SPG comes into play. Oop. I do go back to the beginning. There we go. Sorry about that. As he neared the end of his life in 1724, Bray gathered about 30 of his like-minded friends together as the associates of Dr. Bray. And their two principal goals were sending books to the colonies to create parochial libraries, and also promoting the conversion to Christianity and the education of Blacks in the American colonies. After Bray's death in 1730, it carried on as the associates of the late Dr. Bray. For its first 30 years, it tried to achieve its goals by sending small libraries to colonial clergymen with which they could teach and catechize among their Black parishioners, and by sending catechists to colonies who were either posted to the larger cities, like Sturgeon was to Philadelphia, or who itinerated around the backcountry in the colonies that didn't really have a metropolitan center. But by the mid-1750s, neither of those methods had accomplished much, and the associates began to think about other ways to accomplish their goal. So the Philadelphia story begins in 1757, just as Franklin was embarking on England as the agent for the Pennsylvania Assembly in its dispute with the proprietors over the taxation of proprietary lands and other issues. The Reverend John Waring, the secretary of the Associates, wrote a letter to Franklin asking for his advice. And that's this document here in the Philosophical Society's archives. Waring's letter arrived in Philadelphia after Franklin had sailed to London. So his wife, Deborah, showed the letter to the Reverend William Sturgeon, the graduate of Yale College, who since 1747 had been the assistant minister at Christ Church and the catechist to the Negroes in Philadelphia, supported by the SPG. The vestry had previously written to London asking for help in reaching their Black population, and that led to Sturgeon's appointment. Sturgeon in turn wrote to Franklin in August 1757, recommending that a school be opened in Philadelphia under the care and inspection of the minister or some other prudent person or persons. And Franklin then communicated Sturgeon's proposal to Waring in January 1758 in this letter. And he was obviously enthusiastic about the plan and even saw it possibly extending beyond Philadelphia. So he wrote, "At present, few or none give their Negro children any schooling, partly from prejudice that reading and knowledge in a slave are both useless and dangerous, and partly from an unwillingness in the Black masters and mistresses of common schools to take Black scholars. But a separate school for Blacks might probably have a number of Blacks sent to it. And if on experience it should be found useful, the example might be followed in other colonies and encouraged by the inhabitants in general." And that is exactly what happened. After hearing from Franklin and Sturgeon, the associates set about to implement their vision. Waring consulted Franklin about the expediency of opening the Negro school in Philadelphia. And at their meeting of April 5th, 1758, they agreed to a 3-year trial of such a school at a maximum expense of 20 pounds sterling per annum. The school opened in November 1758 with a mistress and 30 pupils under Sturgeon's direction. The boys were taught to read and the girls to read, sew, knit, and embroider. The mistress was to attend church with the children every Wednesday and Friday, and all her endeavors were to be directed towards making them Christians. And the Bray Associates sent books to the school for their use. This is a list of books sent to Sturgeon in 1759, 64, and 71. And at the right, you see I've blown up the first portion where you can see the various titles they sent, mostly religious works or works about English instruction. I was interested to see that they're also sending 20 copies of the friendly admonition to the drinkers of brandy. The school was immediately successful, and in June 1759, Sturgeon reported that 36 scholars attended regularly. Of those, 25 were enslaved and 11 were free. Deborah Franklin wrote to her husband that she, quote, "went to hear the Negro children catechized at church. It gave me a great deal of pleasure, and I shall send Othello to the school." Yet she may not have done so, for the Franklin's own slave is not included in the only surviving lists of students that postdates her letter. And these are two early Philadelphia lists from 59 and 1762, giving the names of the students. And in the list on the right here, you can see the boys were reading and the girls were reading and sewing. So perhaps because of Sturgeon's favorable report, the associates agreed in January 1760 to open 3 other American schools with all convenient speed. And of course, they sought Franklin's advice about just where they should be established. The associates elected Franklin a member on January 2nd, 1760, and chairman only 2 months later. Then in May 1760, a meeting was held at which both Franklin and Dr. Samuel Johnson were present. And this is the only documentation that survives anywhere that provides evidence that these 2 men ever actually met in person. Franklin also attended occasionally some of the dinners held by the associates when he was in London. And this is one of those invitations. So when Franklin attended that first meeting in January 1760, He recommended to the associates where the 3 prospective schools should be established: New York, Williamsburg, and Newport. And he also recommended the particular men to superintend them. Now, the response of those men was positive, and the schools did indeed open. New York and Williamsburg opened in September 1760, and the Newport School did not begin its operations until 1762. And the associates opened one other Negro school in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1765. And of those 5 schools, only the one in Philadelphia survived the Revolution and reopened. Each school typically had between 20 and 30 students and was supported by an annual grant of about 20 or 25 pounds. Most and perhaps all of the schools were open to both enslaved and free Black children, although the preponderance of students, especially early on, were enslaved. And the Philadelphia School, and perhaps others, welcomed enslaved students whose owners were not members of the Church of England. Before the Revolution, 4 mistresses served the Philadelphia School. We don't know the name of the first one, who was dismissed following complaints of her bad management. The next mistress was Elizabeth Harrison, who was the wife of Richard Harrison, master of the charity school of the Academy of Philadelphia. And then we have Mrs. Ayers, and she moved to the country and at some point and was replaced by Sarah Wilson. Important changes began to occur in 1766. On July 31st, Sturgeon resigned his positions at the United Congregations of Christ Church in St. Peter's because of ill health. And it seems that likely that he ceased to superintend the school at that time. Franklin then recruited 2 of his friends to take over the superintendence of the school. They were Francis Hopkinson and Edward Duffield. Hopkinson is very recognizable to you, I'm sure, as a signer of the Declaration, also a composer who wrote music that he performed on the organ at Christ Church, and he's buried there. Duffield was a clockmaker and a vestryman of Christ Church. I'm told that this portrait, which has been attributed as Duffield, is very likely not to be him, so I had to include it in the absence of any other image of Duffield. They took over. I should also say that Duffield, the clockmaker, we have in the library company in our Logan room an absolutely gorgeous example of his work from 1760 that we're very, very proud of. So Hopkinson and Duffield took over early in 1768. And when they made their first examination of the school, there were 27 students in attendance. About the same time that Sturgeon left the school, the associates were acting to strengthen the institution. The Reverend Abbot Upcher, a wealthy clergyman from Suffolk in England, revealed that he intended to donate 1,000 pounds to the associates for the purchase of an estate in America to support the schools. The associates, of course, again consulted Franklin, who, of course, recommended Philadelphia as the likely place where such an estate could be acquired. So in 1767, the associates appointed Franklin and 4 Philadelphians, undoubtedly recommended by him, as trustees for the land to be purchased. They were Hopkinson and Duffield, the Reverend Jacob Duché, who was minister at the time of the United Congregations, and also Hopkinson's brother-in-law, and David Hall, Franklin's former partner in the printing business. Duché and Hall declined to serve, and with Franklin in London, Hopkinson and Duffield were then left as the only 2 of the 5 appointees remaining in Philadelphia for the purchase of the land. They found a suitable lot, which turned out to be the entire city block bounded by 9th, 10th, Market, and Filbert streets, and concluded the transaction and reported the results in May 1774. So Franklin's influence in making sure that the only land purchased in America took place in Philadelphia had huge implications for the future, as we'll see. So in May 74, as these land negotiations were being completed, the school had 30 pupils, 3 free and 27 enslaved. And it seems that each pupil had a customized curriculum because the mistress taught various combinations of subjects to each pupil, as you can see from this list from 1774, how few pupils were studying each of the different subjects and combinations. Now, knowing that only the girls were taught skills with a needle we may surmise that of the 30 pupils, at least 5 of them were certainly girls. In the fall of '74, the Reverend Thomas Coombe, assistant minister of the United Congregations, undertook the supervision of the school. In July 1775, Coombe made his last report to the associates, the final communication before the revolution. So the school fell into abeyance during the war as communications with Britain were cut and ties between Christ Church and the Anglican metropolis were severed. My book, as you saw, ended at that point. And for several decades, I really didn't think too much about this. But to prepare this talk, I needed to flesh out the story of what happened in Philadelphia after it reopened. And of course, it was the only American school that did reopen after the war. So I delved into the archive once again and made some pretty startling discoveries that carry the story into the mid-1840s, far later than I had reason to think would be the case. Now the story gets interesting because it involves the Reverend Absalom Jones and the relationship between Christ Church and his African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Because the associates had income-producing property in the city, they were able to use that income to support the expenses of reopening the Philadelphia school, and in fact to expand the scope of their activity. By October 1786, Hopkinson was able to report that he had leased out a portion of the land. And during this period, the administrators were Hopkinson and William White, the rector of Christ Church and the newly consecrated first bishop of Pennsylvania, and the new American Episcopal Church. After Hopkinson died in 1791, White brought in Philadelphia merchant Samuel Powell as the other administrator. Powell was also a vestryman of Christ Church. The school did reopen under the direction of Ruth Lewis, who is mentioned in this newspaper posting that Hopkinson placed in the papers, but not on the first Monday in December, as he stated here. Rather, it opened in mid-April 1787 after White had returned from his consecration in London. But within a year's time, it was again full, and by May 1788, there were 11 boys and 21 girls in attendance. By 1795, the associates had enough income from their property to support what White called a more enlarged plan than the single school that had taught just the youngest pupils. What White had in mind was to extend the school to older children, to train boys for the trades, and he also wanted to add mathematics to the curriculum. And to accomplish this, he suggested an affiliation with St. Thomas's Church, which had recently been established by Absalom Jones. Now, Jones and Richard Allen, you may know, were both Black Philadelphians from Delaware, both formerly enslaved, both had bought their freedom, and both worshiped together in the integrated St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. And together they founded the African Free Society in 1787, a mutual aid society for encouraging religion and literacy, and for providing widows and orphans with financial assistance. Early in the 1790s, nobody knows exactly when, they led a walkout over the attempt by St. George's to segregate the Black parishioners on the balcony of the church. And out of this action came an independent African church in 1792. But Jones and Allen soon parted ways over a disagreement about the denominational affiliation of their new church, with Jones establishing the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas in communion with the Episcopal Church, and Allen establishing the first congregation of what became the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or what's now known as Mother Bethel. Both churches opened their first buildings within 12 days of each other in July 1794. On the left here is the new St. Thomas's Church, and Absalom Jones shown on the right. St. Thomas's was built with funds raised from the parish and with subscriptions from sympathetic whites. 2 years later, in 1796, Jones became the first African-American admitted to holy orders in the Episcopal Church when Bishop William White ordained him a deacon. 2 years later, he became a priest. I'm sorry, in 1802, he became a priest. White thought well of Jones, describing him as a man of great weight and being perfectly satisfied with his character and his discretion. And he suggested to the associates that they could help St. Thomas's in one of two ways, either building a separate church schoolroom behind the church building, or providing a stipend for additional students at the school Jones was already operating. The associates could not provide enough funds to build a schoolhouse, so they opted to support Absalom Jones in his teaching. Beginning in 1799, he had taught 12 children in his home with the support of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Later that year, White began providing 20 pounds a year to enable Jones to double that number of students and to begin teaching arithmetic as well as reading and writing. Now, at some point, Jones stopped teaching. White said he was being better provided for by his congregation and no longer needed the money. And he was succeeded by someone named Andrew Summers, who was described as a colored man from Barbados. And eventually Summers returned to Barbados. And then in 1813, a vestryman of St. Thomas named Solomon Clarkson opened a school affiliated with the parish. And then in 1815, the St. Thomas's vestry minutes show that Bishop White had proposed that he was willing to send 10 scholars to that church school run by Clarkson, or any other school in the Episcopal line that they may think proper. And at that point, the vestry resolved to send the 10 boys to the school of Mr. Solomon Clarkson. So Clarkson then welcomed those 10 Bray scholars into his school, and he continued to teach them until 1844, almost 30 years. Now, in addition to fostering this relationship with St. Thomas's, White also recommended that, funds permitting, the associates establish additional schools in Southwark and the Northern Liberties. Now, nothing seems to have materialized in relation to Southwark, but there is evidence of at least a short-lived school in the Northern Liberties. And the intriguing documentation is this single list from 1826, submitted by a James C. Ward, who was an African-American former Presbyterian who had been ordained a deacon in the Episcopal Church by White. And he charged the associates $2 per quarter for each of 10 boys and girls that he taught on Charlotte Street, which is now North Oriana Street in the Northern Liberties. And at the right, you can see he's listed the students and indicated whether they were doing writing or studying the Testament or writing words of 4 syllables. And then he also noted where they lived with their street address. This 1838 publication concentrates somewhat on the schools that were available in Philadelphia at the time. And you can see at the top, it records that there were 12 students in the Bray School. And then down below, you can see there were 40 students in Clarkson's school, 10 of which were the Bray students and 30 were his other students. And it turns out we can tell exactly who these students were because around the same time, there were lists published. This is the one submitted by Sarah Ann Leach for the Bray School in September 1838, which lists her 12 students, giving their ages and what they were studying. And this is one of the reports submitted by Clarkson in 1837, a little before that book was published, listing the 10 students that are studying in his school and what they were reading in history, whether they were reading and writing and what they were studying in arithmetic. Class lists such as these, submitted quarterly to the superintendents of the Philadelphia schools, make the Bray Associates archives an incredibly valued trove of documentation about the students who attended. In addition to the very few class lists we've seen for the pre-revolutionary period, there are more than 90 lists covering the period from 18 1821 to 1845 that identify almost 400 individual pupils. And if you add these three colonial lists, you end up with more than 450 individually identified students on these lists. So if the important questions about this entire 90-year enterprise are how many pupils were educated at these schools, what did they study, and just who were they? The answers, I think, can be found in these many detailed lists that have survived. They've never been exploited and indeed are virtually unknown. The Clarkson and Leach reports end in 1844 and 1845 because the associates had determined in July 1844 that the schools in Philadelphia, having from change of circumstances become entirely unnecessary, would be discontinued on March 1st, 1845. They believed that, quote, very ample provision had been made for the education of the poorer classes in Philadelphia. And I think this is likely a reference to the increasing availability of free public education, albeit segregated, for Philadelphia's growing Black population. The associates did, however, provide Mrs. Leach, who was then more than 70 years old and had been teaching more than 40 years, with a pension of $80 a year. And for Clarkson, who they described as a middle-aged man, quite active and with many other scholars, yielding him a comfortable support, they gave him a gratuity of $50. The future income from the Philadelphia properties was to be used to support the education of Black children in British America, that is, places such as Nova Scotia and Jamaica, where the associates were still quite active. So from their very modest beginning in 1758, the Philadelphia Negro School had grown and thrived, surviving numerous changes in personnel and the upheavals of war and revolution, to bring at least a modicum of education to a large number of Philadelphia's young African Americans. And I think it's a story well worth telling. Let me conclude with a brief mention of a project just getting underway in Williamsburg. The scholars there have identified what they believe is the very building used by the Bray School there, which operated from 1760 to 1774. The building is now on the campus of the College of William and Mary. They were successful in getting a historical marker for the site. And as far as we know, this is the only surviving site of one of the Bray schools anywhere in North America. And they're also launching what they're calling a Bray School Lab. This is a collaborative venture of William and Mary, Colonial Williamsburg, and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And they've started this effort to study the legacy of the school and trace some of the students that they've been able to identify. Now, there's obviously much more extensive and detailed documentation of the Philadelphia schools, which operated for almost 90 years and educated so many students, than there is for this single school in Williamsburg that lasted but 14 years. So I'm hoping that some future Philadelphians will emulate the Virginians and pursue this, I think, very fruitful avenue of research. Thank you for your attention. I'd be glad to take some questions.
Thank you, John, for a really remarkable talk. And a lot of history that has not really seen the light of day, and it's a fascinating story. I'm just thankful to you for researching it and writing about it and sharing it with us and sharing it as part of this great Christchurch celebration. I'll ask those of you in attendance again, if you have questions. We can't see you, we can't see your video. So if you're raising your hands, I can't help you. My dog is barking in the background because it's Zoom. But if you use the Q&A function, I will read your questions and John will answer as best he can. John, the first question we have is from a familiar name, Michelle Flamer. Michelle asks, how did Dr. Franklin's involvement with these schools square with his published views that Blacks were ineducable?
Well, I guess I'd have to take exception to that. Obviously, he didn't think they were ineducable, or he would have said, thanks anyway, I'd rather not get involved. Yes, he had some somewhat anomalous positions on blacks over the course of his life. And I think he changed his views. I could have put up one letter that he wrote to the associates after he paid a visit to the school after he returned to Philadelphia. And he remarked that he had a much better impression at that point after having observed the classroom of just what was possible in terms of educating African Americans. So yes, everyone knows that Franklin was a slave owner and that he said some unkind things, but that at the end of his life, he was president of the Abolition Society and did some fairly remarkable things in favor of the cause. So I think his experience with the Bray Associates could have been very formative in his making that transition from some of his early held views to what he actually experienced and was able to witness, and then maybe brought him around to a somewhat more nuanced and favorable view that was then reflected in his later activities of joining the Abolition Society.
Thank you, John. Second question we have is from Richard Bowles. Richard asks, thanks you for the informative presentation, and asks, dozens of enslaved and free African Americans were baptized at Christ Church in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Do you see a direct or indirect connection between the Bray School and participation in the church?
Yes. I quoted that one letter from Deborah Franklin where her first experience was not going to the school, but commenting that at church she witnessed some of the students being baptized. And I think that gave her an impression that maybe she should look into the school. And then she did and said she thought she would send a fellow to the school. So yes, the Bray Associates being an Anglican organization, it was a religious organization, a missionary organization. And so they were trying to accomplish two purposes simultaneously, which was to Christianize and educate the blacks. They wanted to bring them into the church and to educate them. And that gets to the question of, was the church an abolitionist organization? And the answer is no. They were interested in improving the spiritual condition of the slaves without addressing necessarily their temporal situation or advocating that that baptism inevitably led to emancipation.
Thank you. The third question is from Tim Safford, who asks, what was the relationship between the Bray School and the Quaker school led by Benezette? Did they have different objectives?
Actually, that was in my draft, but I didn't have time to go into it. Sorry. Yes, there's a relationship. Franklin and Benezette knew each other well. They had their paths crossed in many different ways. Benezette emigrated to America in 1731, which happens to be the year the library company was founded. He was a French Huguenot, abolitionist to the extreme. He began teaching in his home in 1839. That was the beginning of the Quaker school. And in 1850, he began taking Black students in the evenings in his home. So his activities with Black education preceded the opening of the Bray School by 8 years. And he was trying to imbue his students with I forget what phrase he used, good thoughts and good actions and all that, the best principles. And it's possible that in opening the Bray School, they would have been influenced by Benezette. They certainly knew of his experience. And then later when they became involved with Absalom Jones, Jones himself had been educated by Benezette. So he was imbued with all of those Quakerly principles, I'm sure. So yeah, I'm sure they were influenced, and they operated simultaneously. There there were Quaker schools operating throughout the period that the Bray School was operating and that the St. Thomas School was operating. So there were a number of separate tracks that were all really trying to accomplish the same purpose and were complementary.
Elizabeth Kimball asks, are there any primary sources that describe the schools from the perspective of the Black community?
None that I have found, other than the fact that St. Thomas's was obviously receptive to this idea that they could work with Bishop White and take the Bray students and mix them with the 30 students who were already in the St. Thomas school. But from their perspective, I don't have anything. Clarkson was interesting. I actually only identified him a couple of weeks ago and found out a little more about him as I went along. He was very highly thought of, and he taught for years and years. But I don't have anything that he wrote, nothing with his name on it, other than the list that the 40 lists that he submitted to the associates with his, identifying his students. So there really is not much of a paper trail. Unfortunately, the St. Thomas, many of their early archives were destroyed in the 19th century. So there are some records. For instance, they have a record of births and baptisms, which I think could be quite useful in trying to identify some of these individual students who were named. If their age is given in one of these lists, then that person might be associated with a particular entry in the birth and baptismal book that might provide information about their family or something like that. But the documentation really isn't there to the extent that there is for the Anglo sources.
Thank you, John, for that. Donna Rilling asks whether you learned anything about how long a typical child might stay in the school.
There was a lot of turnover. Actually, I can't quite go back to that slide, but Mrs. Leach, for instance, had the most students. She was a teacher from 1830 to 45, so 15 years, give or take. And her lists, which I've actually transcribed all these things. I have a huge spreadsheet now of all these students. There are 188 individual students on her list over 15 years. But with these lists, because the students do recur from one list to the next, by using this spreadsheet, you could do a sort of prosopographical study and figure out who stayed how many years, and see which teacher had the most turnover, or what the average length of stay was, the shortest, the longest. So yes, that you can ascertain that information, but I haven't had time to do that yet. But yeah, I would say there was turnover. We find sometimes somebody's on one list and then they're gone by the next year. So
yeah. Rhonda Ferre asks, did Washington have an opinion on the schools?
None that he expressed, as far as I know.
A couple of questions, some I'm saving for you, saving for the end.
But the easy ones?
Yeah, I'm not sure there are a lot of easy ones. These are all really great questions.
They are good. They are very good questions. Yeah.
We have two questions that are sort of similar. One is from Marie Weaver. Was the Christ Church involvement with the Bray School controversial among the parishioners? And then a similar question about from I think Regina Robinson. Was there public opposition to the Bray schools for educating Black children?
There was in some colonies. not in Philadelphia, as far as I know, nor am I aware of any controversy within the congregation. Although someone more familiar with the vestry minutes, like Carol Smith, might be able to answer that question better. Opposition, yes. Yes, I wrote an article that came out a little before my dissertation was published. It was called Impediments to the Christianization and Education of Blacks in Colonial America, in a fairly obscure journal called the Historical Magazine of the Protestant Episcopal Church. Anyway, in there, I took all of the correspondence that I published in my book, and I kind of extracted all of the, and the book really comprised letters written by the representatives of the associates in the colonies, either the teachers or the superintendents of these various schools, or the individual clergymen who were sent books and went around as catechists. They all made reports back to London, and that's really what the book is. And I kind of extracted all of the comments they made about the impediments they encountered and the different attitudes of the slave owners and why they didn't want to send their slaves to the schools. And so, yes, there was opposition, and there were all kinds of reasons and excuses that were kind of put forward to explain why some efforts were more successful than others.
A question from Sheila Jones is, how much of the Bray Associate Project was about the erasure of African cultural practices by Christian education?
That's hard to answer. They were certainly teaching how to read by using the Bible, particularly the New Testament. And there were, books of catechism, and there were also spelling books and other things like that. I think I would say the effort was more about, inculcating the Christian religion rather than trying to efface something else. Although obviously you couldn't do one without the other. But these school teachers were, they were mostly just, local Philadelphians or Newporters or New Yorkers. I don't know that I would attribute to them any great, desire to destroy African-American culture necessarily. But I don't know.
Right. Marty Mangold Maryland asks, do we have follow-on knowledge of the female students or of Othello? And she thanks you for the talk, or he thanks you for the talk, sorry.
What, more than Othello?
Othello, Franklin's slave. Do we know any?
Well, no, all I know is that he didn't show up on the lists. So, and of course, Franklin doesn't, or for Deborah, they don't mention their enslaved servants very much in their writings.
Right.
So it's kind of a, you can't prove a negative, but because it wasn't on those lists that were written shortly after her letter, I'm just assuming that it never happened. As far as the girls who attended, I think it's wonderful that we have their full names and we know what they were studying. We know their ages. And so that's why I say, I think there's grist for the mill there of finding out much more about these people and maybe tracing their later lives or even their descendants.
Great. Kamika Williams Witherspoon asks 2 questions. Were the African-American children baptized in Christ Church, baptized in the church proper or somewhere else? And were the students in the Bray schools primary grades, were they sort of at elementary school age, I think is what the question is asking.
Yeah, I found a 3-year-old on one of the lists, but most of them were, I would say, anywhere from 4, 5, 6 up to I saw a 16-year-old, but that was also pretty unusual. I would say maybe in the sort of 5 to 11 and 12 range. But because they hadn't had any previous schooling, I think they were getting pretty rudimentary, elementary education. You know, some of the younger students they would have taught them their letters. That would have been the first thing. And then from there, they would have progressed to some reading. Writing came later for the older students, and only in Philadelphia. I've had some interesting correspondence with people working on the histories of other colonies and the other schools. There's no evidence that writing was taught in any of the other schools, especially down south in Fredericksburg and Williamsburg. But they did teach writing to the older kids in Philadelphia, and then eventually mathematics as well.
That's very interesting. Some other questions from Michelle Flamer. Michelle asks, where can we access the list of students? She has ancestors who are buried at Bethel Burying Ground, including one in 1774. So, and Michelle also asked whether any Native American children were educated at the schools.
That's a really good question. None that I know of, none that were identified as such. But the Bray Associates, their purview included both Blacks in all the colonies and Native Americans to some extent. And in my book, there are a couple of documents that relate to efforts to educate Native Americans. But there were no schools as such, other than as Eliezer Wheelock's, which became Dartmouth. And actually, William and Mary had a Native American kind of affiliate to it. But in Philadelphia, no.
There is a question from Mary Frances Davis, which I've been holding on to because it's a bit outside the scope of your talk, John, but I think I'm just going to read it to just bring it into the forum. And if you want to respond to it, you can feel free to. Mary Frances Davis asks, what can we do now to improve schools for minority students? And I think she's thinking about Christ Church in particular, and mentions Christ Churches, such as Christ Church participation in a march from a minority Philadelphia school to a white wealthy suburban school to even out the funding and thus the quality of education. But I think that is something Mary Frances wanted to bring before the audience.
Well, it sounds like a fine idea. I think funding of public schools is kind of a travesty. It seems to me it would be nice if we aggregated all the property taxes every Pennsylvanian paid in somewhere other than locally, and distributed them in some more equitable fashion. I don't know that anybody's actually proposed doing that officially or how far it's gotten, but I see Barbara is on the line. Maybe Barbara could answer what about this program with Christ Church, which I hadn't heard of before.
I think the person was proposing it as an idea.
Yeah, it was actually an idea, not something we have in process.
Okay.
I wanted to bring back a part of an earlier question and maybe this relates to Deborah Franklin's letter, or maybe there's other knowledge. When African-American children were baptized in Christ Church, were they baptized in the church proper or somewhere else?
Oh, yes. I didn't answer that question. I would assume the church proper, but again, that's a question for someone more, in the church who knows those traditions.
Yeah.
I'm not aware that there was any, segregated place where it would have happened.
I should insert into this point of the conversation, George Boudreau, renowned Franklin scholar who's been watching the presentation, contributes that Othello died young. And so we may not know much more about maybe part of the reason why he would not have appeared there. There may be some other issue, but anyway, George contributed that.
That's interesting to know. Maybe he died even before those lists were made.
Possibly.
Mhm.
Regina Robinson asks, is there a connection between the Bray schools and the Institute for Colored Youth?
Not that I'm aware of.
They're separate in time by a good amount of time, I think. Well, John, I think we've gone over time a bit, but I think that's because it's such an incredible talk. Barbara may want to say another word in a moment, but I just wanted to thank you again for this remarkable presentation and the great research. So thank you again, and thank all of you for coming.
You're very welcome, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara, do you have a?
I don't necessarily have any ending remarks. I'm just so grateful that John has shared his knowledge with us tonight, and grateful to the library company for partnering with us.
Yeah, and Barbara, we're grateful that we were able to share, that you brought the program to us to share. It is certainly of profound interest to our shareholders and members, as well as to members of Christ Church. And there's certainly a lot of overlap between those groups as well. So again, thank you all. We are recording the talk. We will send out the recording to everyone who has registered. And I don't know, we may be posting it up on our YouTube channel shortly after that. But again, thank you and good night. And we'll hope to see you back at the library company sometime soon. And have a good night again. Thanks.
Very good. Good night, all. Thank you.